Oh, what is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. And in this video, we're going to dive into what's been the hot topic of the New York Giants. It's been a while since I did a video. Obviously, I've done a lot of live streams. Going to start to get a lot of video content up for you guys now that the offseason is getting underway, and there's going to be a lot more to talk about. The Giants, of course, have started to bring in some coaches. I think the offensive line coach was a good move. I'm not going to read too much into any of these signings, though. I'm not going to over analyze any of these signings until we see how the players perform on the field. I think we've all been victims, in recent years to getting overexcited about some of the coaches that the New York Giants brought in. But I'm certainly excited about the offensive line coach that we brought in. He comes from the Raiders. When he initially took the job, I think they ranked 28th as an offensive line. He went there the first year. I think they were ranked 12th or 10th. They were 10th and 12th both years that he was there as the offensive line coach. And that was with 16 different starting lineups his first year. So definitely a guy that I think should be a massive upgrade, but the proof will be in the pudding next year. So we'll have to wait and see. They also hired a running back coach today, as well as I think a strength and conditioning coach as the Giants continue to fill out their coaching staff. And of course, the defensive coordinator will be the big bombshell. And when that comes out, I'll certainly talk about it. And like I said, I want to do a lot more videos for you guys now that there's stuff to actually talk about. During the season, it was a disaster. We were all kind of waiting to how things turned out. I'll probably have another video talking about the quarterback situation, maybe as early as tomorrow, if I have the time to do it, to really give my opinion on what I think the New York Giants should do this offseason at that spot, being that it's the most important position. But in this video, we're going to talk about the back and forth on this situation now that has come out about Brian Daboll and the coaching staff, and whether or not you as a fan, in my opinion at least, should be a little bit skeptical, a little bit, on guard about Brian Daboll, a guy that we were all really excited about after his first year with the New York Giants. He won Coach of the Year. The team unexpectedly made the playoffs. And now you're starting to see all these reports come out. I'm going to take some of it with a grain of salt. I'm not going to read too much into any of this because you have to consider where these reports are coming from. At the end of the day, the negative report is coming from Pat Leonard. It's coming from Pat Leonard. Now, I'm not going to say that there's not any truth to this. I'm sure that there are some sprinkles of truth in this article. Do I think some of it's probably exaggerated? Yeah. Especially when you factor in who it's coming from. It's coming from a guy who didn't get along with Brian Daboll. It's coming from a couple of gentlemen who were just fired by Brian Daboll. So they're not going to go out of their way to say good things about him. And I'm sure that they tried to rub salt in the wound on the way out because they didn't like the way that things ended. And by the same token, I'm sure the positive article that came out that I will briefly touch on as well, because I think it's good to take both sides of, the argument. I'm sure that some of that was a little too pro-Giants. So I think you always got to try to read between the lines and read in the middle, not take too much out of either story. I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle of both of these articles that came out. But first, I'll touch on the article. It came out about a week ago, but I just think it's important to touch on that before I pull up the article and some of the quotes from Giants Wire, because I thought they did a really good job in terms of breaking down the article and the key parts from the article from Pat Leonard. And I'll give my opinion on each. But I wanted to pull up some of the key talking points from the initial article that went to the New York Post. So let's start with that. This is what went down, according to people in the building who were aware of the situation. Daboll met with Martindale on Monday and told him there were staff changes coming. We all know the story by now, right? But I'm going to read it. Daboll mentioned the dismissals of special teams coach Thomas McGahee and offensive line coach Bobby Johnson. There was no secret how close Daboll is with Johnson, and this one was a tough one for Daboll. But he felt it was necessary for the betterment of the team moving forward. Daboll told Martindale he wanted him to stay, but that he was going to fire the Wilkins brothers. Now, of course, if you're not familiar, which you probably are if you're a dire Giants fan, the Wilkins brothers are tied at the hip with Wink Martindale. They came over from Baltimore, coaches that he really respected, coaches that he wanted on this coaching staff with him while he was coaching the New York Giants. Martindale brought the Wilkins, there you go, brought the Wilkinses with him from the Giants, to the Giants, rather, from the Ravens. On the sideline, it is Drew Wilkins helping Martindale with the personnel groupings and directing traffic for him. Drew Wilkins helps Martindale devise the defensive schemes. Martindale, angered by this news, cursed out Daboll, said his piece, got up, slammed the door, and walked out of the building. Later on in the article, it went on to say this. There was a feeling in the building that Martindale and Drew Wilkins were creating their own fiefdom, basically meaning that they were conspiring with one another to try to make Brian Daboll look bad. And I think that makes sense when you read the other article that we'll talk about later, and you see some of the things in terms of Joe Shane, for instance, listening in on the play calling throughout the games. Who do you think went to Joe Schoen and told him to listen in? But at least I think this is probably coming from the Brian Daboll point of view. So this is how he felt what they were doing within the coaching staff, at times bypassing Daboll and believing they had to answer only to each other and ultimately ownership. Daboll is all about collaboration, and this was not that. Martindale 60 was extremely popular with the players and his side of the ball. While hardly dominant, consistently performed better than the offense, which is Daboll's ball of wick. That caused friction as well. I mean, to be fair, they probably should have performed better. We were down to our third-string quarterback. Andrew Thomas missed half the season. Same thing with Saquon Barkley. So the defense was, for the most part, relatively healthy. So they probably should have performed better, but let's continue. When safety Xavier McKinney complained about a lack of communication between players and the defensive staff, Martindale went out of his way to fuel the fire rather than douse it, which shows a difference in Martindale's style and the way that Daboll prefers to limit all distractions. Martindale, highly engaging in his weekly press conferences, frequently praised his group, which raised some eyebrows after the less than robust outings. He did not, however, have any praise for his defense after a 49-17 loss to Dallas in Week 10, as the Giants were mauled, giving up a ghastly 640 yards, the second most yards allowed in franchise history, and the most amassed by the Cowboys in any game in their history. In that game, Daboll encouraged Martindale to keep blitzing, keep the blitzes coming, and Martindale did so, but the results were abysmal. A few weeks later, a Fox pregame stated that Daboll and Martindale's relationship was in a bad place. And then it goes on to continue to talk about the story, but you get the gist. According to the New York Post article, essentially, Wink on the way out cursed out Brian Daboll. Daboll, he felt, went behind his back when he fired his guys with Wilkins. The way that I read that is, who is Wink to get upset about that? Like it said earlier in the article, Daboll had to fire his friend, the offensive line coach, for not getting the job done. The outside linebackers weren't doing very well last year. We ranked 29th in sacks, despite the fact that we had the highest blitz percentage in football. So if Daboll felt like there needed to be a change there, I think that's his job to go ahead and do that. Obviously, from Wink's perspective, those are his guys, and he probably felt like if he was going to fire them, he probably should have handled it better. So I'm sure that there was some friction as far as that goes. Then the article basically went on to say, like I talked about earlier, that at least Daboll, because I think that's who this article is coming from, Daboll, maybe Schoen, felt like they were going behind Daboll's back to try to make him look bad to ownership. At least that's the way that this article comes across to me. Now, when you see what I think is the Wink rebuttal, going to the press, talking to Pat Leonard, there's a lot more that came out of this story. And like I said, take for it from what you will. I am not going to be a guy that's going to come on here off a Pat Leonard article and is going to start claiming that Brian Daboll needs to be fired. Before we read any of this, okay? Brian Daboll, do I think there's probably some truth to this? Absolutely. And I think there's some truth to the initial article as well. Brian Daboll's a second-year head coach. It's the first year that he's had to deal with any kind of friction. Like his first year was rainbows and butterflies, no expectations. You go to the playoffs, you win a playoff game. I mean, they were, it was great. I'm sure it was a great environment. This year, things got a lot more turbulent, and it's his first year as a head coach having to deal with that. So I'm not stunned that there was friction between Wink and between Daboll, so on and so forth. And if you think back, Tom Coughlin, and you're talking about a guy that was mature, a guy that had been a head coach for years, long before he was with the New York Giants, with the Jacksonville Jaguars. He had to change his ways as he was a coach with the New York Giants. So just because Daboll may or may not have handled things properly from within the locker room does not mean that he cannot grow and cannot learn from that. I think you start to judge Daboll next year in terms of the way that he learns from some of the mistakes that he may have made this year. And I'm sure that there were mistakes made. He didn't have his best year. But let's jump into some of the things that came out in terms of Daboll's coaching style and why a lot of people are a little nervous right now about the New York Giants head coach and the coaching staff in general. Let's pull up the article. I'm just going to read it because there is so much to take out of this article. And like I said, I thought that Giants Wire did the best job in terms of breaking down the quotes. So we're just going to read it from the top, and then I'll give my opinion based off each bullet point. In the aftermath of defensive coordinators Wink Martindale parting ways with the New York Giants, several reports have surfaced suggesting that head coach Brian Daboll is erratic and irrational and regularly dresses down his assistants in a personal fashion. Those reports continued on Monday with Pat Leonard of the New York Daily News peeling back the curtain on the Giants' internal strife even further. In a deep dive into the deteriorating situation in East Rutherford, Leonard revealed several new details, including Daboll placing blame for the poor offensive performance on other coordinators and a complete refusal to accept any blame for the regression in 2023. Leonard reveals that Daboll repeatedly took over play calling, often losing his temper with coordinators for doing what he asked, all while deflecting any responsibility. In Week 11, Daboll reportedly slammed Martindale for allowing the Washington Commanders to remain in the game despite that unit's solid performance. It was a repeat offense for Daboll. This is from the article directly. Wink Martindale's defense had forced 4 turnovers. Thomas McGahee's special teams unit had forced another, and Mike Kafka's offense with Tommy DeVito at quarterback had scored 2 of its 3 touchdowns on short fields off those takeaways. But now Washington's offense was driving, aided by a Kayvon Thibodeau roughing the passer penalty outside the red zone, and that's when Daboll started playing the blame game on Martindale and the defensive staff. And this was supposedly a quote that he had to say that I believe, and we'll hear about it later on throughout the article, that Joe Schoen listened in on. You're going to lose this game, just like you lost the Jets game, Daboll griped on the headset, according to numerous sources in the building. Daboll was blaming the defense for the Giants' infamous 13-10 overtime loss to the Jets on October 29th, in which the offense had thrown for -9 yards, and Daboll's late-game mismanagement had opened the door to a full-scale, team-wide meltdown. I mean, obviously that doesn't look good on Daboll. If you think back to that game, that was a game that the defense was the only reason that the New York Giants had a prayer in that game. That was the game where DeVito was thrown in when it was poor weather conditions against a good defense, where the Giants refused to throw the ball, where they took the ball to start the overtime. You knew that they probably should have kicked off because the offense wasn't going to do anything. The defense was the only chance that we had in that football game. So obviously the optics here, if this is accurate, don't look good. Is it fabricated? I don't know. I can't say. Was Daboll maybe upset at one individual play and he said that and it's being, maybe taken a bit out of context? Maybe Martindale didn't do something that Daboll wanted him to do on a certain play, and who knows? It could be taken a little bit out of context. But obviously, if you're reading it from the article, doesn't look good. Let's continue. Daboll is never short on criticism, but apparently is always short on solutions. That's the trademark of an underperformer. Daboll's sideline behavior was destructive in many coaches' opinions. His input was never proactive, always reactionary, and his outrage was rarely accompanied by a suggested solution. He has no composure, one team source said. Let's continue. Martindale reportedly reached out to Giants ownership as a way to circumvent Daboll. So I think that goes back to the initial article where Daboll, from his perspective, felt like rather than collaborating, rather than coming to me and trying to work on things, you went to ownership and you went to Joe Schoen to try to make me potentially lose my job, to try to make me look bad. That's what I take from this. This is the situation that I think that Daboll was basically pointing to, which eventually led general manager Joe Schoen to listen in on the dysfunction. Now Schoen was monitoring the dynamic at Washington after being alerted by several meaningful parties that Daboll's behavior and the sideline dynamic were not constructive. Schoen would stay on the headset for 4 games, sources say, against the Commanders, Patriots, Packers, and Saints before stepping back offline for the final 3. So if that's true, you basically had Joe Schoen, I would think, because if Daboll knew about it, he's probably not he's probably not going to be himself. He's probably going to be on his heels knowing that ownership may be listening to this. So you basically, I think the way that I'm reading that is Wink, Wilkins, and his crew went to probably Mara, and they said they were complaining about Daboll as the head coach, and they probably did it so much that then Mara probably then went to Schoen and said, I want you to look into this. I want you to listen into this. And he listened to it for 4 games. Obviously not good. From what I understand, from what I've read on Twitter, it does happen around the league, but it's not a good look that your general manager has to listen in because there's dysfunction from within the coaching staff. But let's continue. Daboll is demanding taking play calling duties from Mike Kafka, giving them to other assistants, and then giving them back at random. First off, let me start off by saying this before we read this part of it. I want Daboll to take over as the play caller. Because if I was this year, I'm talking about. Because if I was Daboll, that's what I would do. I've said that several times on my live streams. You're now entering year 3. You're going to be on the hot seat. This is New York. We don't care that you won Coach of the Year in 2022. We've seen this several times. Eric Mangini with the New York Jets had a ton of success his first year with the Jets. He was out of there 2 years later. I think he won Coach of the Year. He was certainly called Eric Manginius. I remember all that. He was fired 2 years later. We saw the same thing with McAdoo, right? He only got 2 years. He completely fell apart the next year. So Daboll cannot afford to have another 5-6 win season. So if I'm Daboll, I'm putting it upon myself. I'm going to take over as the play caller, especially if the New York Giants are going to draft the quarterback. And that remains to be seen. I don't know if they're going to, or I think they're going to. I don't know if it'll be a first-round quarterback. But if the Giants are going to draft their next potential franchise quarterback in this year's draft, which I don't know if they're going to or not, I think it's even more important that Daboll takes over as the play caller. Because as a fan, I don't want the same situation to take place for the next quarterback that took place for Daniel Jones early on in his career, which is complete dysfunction. New play caller after new play caller after new play caller. Daboll, you were hired here. The only reason you're a head coach to begin with is because of your strength with quarterbacks. Dating back to Tua with Alabama, Josh Allen with the Bills. That's why he was hired there. If we draft a quarterback, I want you calling the plays. And that's what I expect to happen if we draft a quarterback. If we don't, maybe Kafka does come back for another year. We'll have to wait and see. But that's the way I look at it, because if the offense does well next year, Kafka probably moves on. He's already getting head coaching opportunities. He may not even be back this year. You're more than likely going to have a new play caller the following year anyway. So if I'm Daboll, I probably just want to assume play calling duties from day one next year. That's the way I would look at it. But let's jump into it. Daboll is demanding taking play calling duties from Mike Kafka, giving them to other assistants, and then giving them back at random. This is chaotic, in my opinion. Now, I don't fault Daboll at all for assuming play calling duties week 2 against Arizona. First 6 quarters of the season, the Giants hadn't scored a point. They looked completely lost. They needed a spark. And again, who knows if this is being exaggerated? Who knows, right? Take it with a grain of salt. But in that instance, if I was Daboll, I probably would have done the same thing. Team needs a spark. The offense ain't getting it done. He took over in that Arizona game. They were able to come back and win the football game. At that point, Daboll probably should have just assumed play calling duties, if we're being honest. That's probably what he should have did. But it also is not a good look for Mike Kafka. So he probably didn't want dysfunction from within the coaching staff, because that doesn't do Mike Kafka a lot of favors in terms of his potential to, move up the ranks, whether it be with the Giants or someone else in the future. So that's probably what happened there. But I can't blame Daboll for taking over play calling duties from within that game. He obviously made the right decision. It's the only reason why we came back. But if this was like a musical chair situation like this article is insinuating, that's another story. That shows a little bit of this dysfunction, similar to what Joe Judge did when he was constantly subbing in and out offensive line coaches week in and week out. We had offensive line men and offensive line coaches, if we're being honest, this first year. But that screams dysfunction. I think Daboll, if this is true, I think Daboll needs to take this as a learning experience and not do that in the future. I think if you make a decision, you should probably stick to it and not constantly shift in and out. Let's continue to read. Daboll took play calling away from Kafka multiple times, according to his source, and gave it back each time. He gave it to quarterback coach Shea Tierney for the second half in Dallas in week 10, per sources. Of course, that's the game where the New York Giants were getting blown out. Daboll's unpredictability, one source said, was his defining trait. There was no pattern, rhyme, or reason to his changes from other perspectives. Daboll also took over Kafka's offensive meetings in week 7 ahead of a game against Washington, as the Daily News first reported. And he didn't give complete control back to Kafka until week 11, after the offense had averaged 11.75 points during that 1-3 stretch. Okay. I'm not going to kill him for that. You're the head coach. You feel like you should take over the meetings. I get that. I don't think you should be killed for that. But the constant and going as far to give Shea Tierney the play calling duties, that to me is almost a punish. That is a punishment. It's one thing if the head coach feels like he needs to step in, his job's on the line. But to say, Kafka, you're not good enough to call the plays, I'm basically going to give your assistant the play calling duties. That's a slap in the face. And if this is true, yeah, Kafka has a little as a reason to have a gripe with the New York Giants. If this is true, I probably don't expect Mike Kafka to be back. Let's continue. Want to join the New York Giants? Don't say some who have experienced Daboll's wrath. The story of the Giants' 2023 undoing isn't about a personal feud between Daboll and Martindale and the past, though. It's about bad football and a flawed process that still exists inside the Giants' walls. It's about an organization with enough problems that one Giants staffer recently advised an NFL assistant calling about a vacancy, do not come here. I'm not going to go crazy about that. I mean, when a team's losing, it's usually not going to be a good environment. The truth of the matter is, if the Giants had won 9 games this year, this wouldn't even be an article. This wouldn't even be a story. If the Giants got the ball to bounce their way 3 different times more than it did this year, they made the playoffs like the Green Bay Packers did, probably wouldn't even be a story. So I'm not going to read too much into it. There's conflicts in the NFL. There's conflicts in every job in life. It's now Daboll's job to find guys that he could work better with. That's what a good head coach does, and we'll see the adjustments that he makes in terms of his coaching staff this season. Let's continue. Daboll's reportedly never wrong, while all of those around him are always wrong. Although he apparently has no solutions, he doesn't hesitate to place blame. Daboll receives advice on his headset in those moments from an analytics and game management team. But one source called that collaboration a broken process, saying it's not thorough or advanced. And regardless of what is discussed during the week, Daboll's game day decisions become up for grabs, impulse calls without guardrails. It's like, wait, what did we hear that meeting for, the source said? There's a lot of inconsistency or doing the direct opposite of what we had talked about. The rest of the league is too far ahead, and you see it affecting the results of the games. When Daboll gave Martindale the game ball following a Week 12 victory, I'm not even going to read into this. We all knew that was probably staged. Well, now we definitely know, after these reports have come out, that there was friction between them. I'm not even going to read into this. This is basically going to go on to say that it was staged, that Daboll gave Wink the game ball after the report came out from Jay Glazer, which was fairly obvious. We all just kind of poke fun of it afterward, but I'm not even going to read too much into that. But that's the article. And yes, do I think there's some things in here that are probably truthful? Yeah. Do I think some of it's exaggerated? Yeah, especially coming from Pat Leonard. Okay, I'm not going to take everything that Pat Leonard has to say as 100% truth. I think some of the things that were probably said in this article were probably exaggerated upon. We're probably, but there's definitely some truth to this. I'm sure there's things that Daboll has to work on. But like I said, midway through the video, there were things that Tom Coughlin had to work on too. That's what being a great head coach is about, learning from your mistakes and building up on it. Daboll's getting a 3rd year. People like Pat Leonard can't wait to make articles like this because they know there's a portion of the fan base that wants turmoil. They want friction. They want drama. They want to have the venom and the proof to say, well, we got to fire this guy. Because we're passionate as fans. We like turnover. That's the truth. There's a wide portion of the fan base that was probably looking for any little excuse to say, let's fire Brian Daboll. And Pat Leonard couldn't wait to give it to him. Do I think he should be fired? No. Do I think he's on thinner ice than he probably would have been had this season not apparently been as dysfunctional as it was? Yes. I think Daboll has to produce next year, which I will talk about in my next video as far as the quarterback situation goes and where I think the New York Giants will go. But I think he's on thin ice next year. I do think he's going to have to produce, and we'll see if he does. A lot of that's going to have to do with the coaching staff that he brings in and the offseason moves that this New York Giants team makes. I'm thrilled that the Eagles and Cowboys lost yesterday. That's good news. Probably should have talked about that at the top of the video. But we'll see how the New York Giants do next year. Definitely going to have a lot of videos out for you guys in the coming weeks. Looking forward to the offseason. Looking forward to talking draft, free agency, everything else. Talk cap space. Like I said, may even have a quarterback video up tomorrow. So definitely be by on the channel to check it out. As always, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.